They say back in the old days, if you wanted someone gone, Jim Miller could make it happen. For the right price, that is. You see, in addition to being a part-time deputy and devoted deacon in the Methodist Church, Miller was also a stone-cold killer for hire. And trust me when I say that's just the tip of the iceberg. Is it true that Miller murdered his own grandparents when he was just 8 years old? What about the stories of him wearing a steel plate under his jacket to deflect bullets? And did he really kill the man who killed Billy the Kid? Stick around and we'll discuss all of this and more, including Miller's connection to the infamous John Wesley Hardin, how he earned the pious nickname of Deacon, and just what it was that made him one of the deadliest and most frightening figures in all of Old West history. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. James Brown Miller was born on October 25, 1861, in Van Buren, Arkansas. The family would move to Franklin, Texas when Jim was still a baby, but other than that, there's not a whole lot known of Miller's early life. Legend has it that both of his parents died shortly after the move, and Jim was then sent to live with his grandparents over in Coryell County. And per legend, he ended up killing both of them. Yes, you heard that correctly. James Miller allegedly murdered his own grandparents when he was just 8 years old. After which, he simply moved in with his sister and her family like nothing happened. Or at least that's how the story goes. Truth is, there's no evidence of such a crime ever occurring. While Jim's father did die fairly young, his mama was still alive and well as late as 1884. You can find her, Jim, and even Jim's 16-year-old sister all living together on the 1880 census for Coryell County. That said, Miller's first known victim was indeed a member of his own family. That is, if you consider brother-in-law to be family, which I personally do not. Okay, Mike, Russell. Now, in all seriousness, Jim's sister married a guy named John Coop in late September of 1881. And for whatever reason, Miller and Coop just did not see eye to eye. As you'll soon come to learn, not seeing eye to eye with Jim Miller was a good way of ensuring an early grave. To quote historian Bill James, Coop was killed with a shotgun as he slept on the night of July 30th, 1884. Although accused, Jim claimed that he was attending a camp meeting with Miss Georgia Large at the time of the killing. During his trial, Miss Large testified that Jim left her about 7 o'clock and did not return until about 9. It was proven to the satisfaction of the jury that Miller could have ridden to Coop's house on a fast horse, killed his brother-in-law, and returned during the time specified. Convicted, he received a life sentence but appealed the verdict and won a reversal. He was not tried again. End of quote. And yeah, trust me when I say this is not the last time that Miller wound up getting away with murder. After the trial, he drifted west to San Saba, where, according to the legendary lawman D. Harkey, he was arrested yet again. The charge was relatively minor, though, so Miller would soon be released, at which point he moved to neighboring McCulloch County and got a job punching cattle for a man named Clements. And if that name sounds familiar, it's likely due to Clements having been balls deep in the Sutton-Taylor feud of the 1870s. He was also first cousins to John Wesley Hardin. Now, by the time Miller arrived, the feud had already been over for quite some time. If I'm not mistaken, the last known killings occurred way back in the fall of 1876. Still, though, be that as it may, I guess Man and Clements just had a hard time staying out of trouble. By the spring of 1887, he found himself in a highly contested race for sheriff of the newly formed Runnels County. And in doing so, he got crossways of a marshal named Joe Townsend. Their beef finally came to a head in late March when Townsend shot Manning dead in a Bellinger City saloon. Not long thereafter, Townsend himself was the recipient of a shotgun blast while riding home one evening in the dark. He would survive minus an arm, but it's widely believed that Jim Miller was the attempted assassin. If true, this would only serve to further cement his relationship with the remaining Clements. And hell, just a few years later, Miller would even marry the late Manning's daughter, Mary Ann. In the meantime, though, following the shooting of Townsend, Miller seems to have vanished. Some say he went back home and visited his family, while others theorize that he drifted west into the Seven Rivers region in New Mexico. And speaking of this period later on, Miller would claim to have, quote, lost my notchstick on Mexicans that I killed on the border, end quote. He doesn't pop up again until August 1891 when he pinned on the badge of a Reeves County deputy sheriff. It's also there in Reeves County a few months later where he tied the knot with the aforementioned Mary Ann Clements. Now, the sheriff of Reeves County at this time was a former Texas Ranger named Bud Frazer. And although things went well at first, Miller was soon accused of rustling livestock. He denied the charges, of course he did, but he would still end up losing his job as a deputy after killing a prisoner. According to Jim, the prisoner was trying to escape, but according to others, the dead man had threatened to spill the beans regarding Miller's thievery. Either way, like I said, Jim got the axe. No big deal, though, as he simply had the good folks of Pecos, Texas, appoint him as the town marshal. Once again, per biographer Bill James, quote, "In spite of this controversy, Miller was well established in Pecos, where he was a church member and had many friends. His mild manner and almost saintly actions led some to believe that he was almost faultless." End quote. And yeah, this is really about the time that Miller began garnering that enduring title of Deacon Jim. Not only did he pretend to be a devoted member of the local Methodist church, but he also avoided alcohol and tobacco like they was the plague. Hell, he even dressed the part by wearing a long black frock coat, even in the dead of summer, and for reasons that will soon become very apparent. Now, Pecos was and still is the seat of Reeves County. That being the case, Miller and his former boss, Sheriff Frazer, were forced to see each other on a regular basis. And to say that Miller still harbored a grudge after losing his job is a wee bit of an understatement. He soon surrounded himself with a small group of hard cases he called deputies, and it wasn't long before things got so tense that Frazer sent for some of his old Texas Ranger buddies to arrest Jim and his brother-in-law Manny. Apparently they and a few of their fellow hoodlums were planning on staging a gunfight during which Frazer would accidentally on purpose catch a stray round. A local by the name of Con Gibson overheard their scheming and told the sheriff, thus resulting in Jim being taken into custody. There was a trial, but the star witness, Mr. Gibson, ended up getting himself killed before he could take the stand. Imagine that. And his untimely demise did result in Miller being acquitted. Finally, in mid-April of 1894, he and Sheriff Frazer decided to stop with all the foreplay and get down to business. Frazer accused Miller of having Gibson killed and then, without warning, opened fire, plugging Jim multiple times at close range, including 2 rounds straight to the chest. To Frazer's astonishment, Miller just shrugged off the rounds and began returning fire. Even when Frazer shot him in the arm, Jim just shifted his pistol to his other hand and continued shooting. It wasn't until one of the sheriff's bullets struck Miller just below the diaphragm that he finally toppled over. According to Glenn Shirley in Shotgun for Hire, Miller's buddies carried him back to his hotel where, quote, "They were amazed to find him very much alive. A quick examination revealed that 3 of Frazer's bullets had landed within a space of 2 inches, directly over his heart. They had flattened against a tough steel plate that he wore over his chest, concealed by his coat. For the first time, Miller's own men realized why he wore that black coat even in the heat of August." End of quote. And yeah, despite that steel plate, Jim was still pretty banged up. He'd convalesced for a spell at a ranch outside of town, but this feud with Frazer was far from over. The two would meet up again there in Pecos on December 26, 1894. They threw down pretty much on sight, and the results were similar to the previous altercation, only this time with both of them sustaining wounds. Important to note that Bud was no longer the sheriff when this second fight took place. He had lost the most recent election, and ironically, Jim Miller filed charges against him for attempted murder. And to represent himself in court, Miller retained the legal services of his cousin by marriage, John Wesley Hardin. Now, Hardin had only recently gotten out of prison back in February of '94. He received a pardon the following month, and by that summer, he had already passed the Texas bar and obtained a license to practice law, just in time to serve as the prosecuting attorney in Frazer's trial. A trial that, as fate would have it, received a change of venue to El Paso, Texas. Not that it really mattered, as the judge would dismiss the case due to conflicting testimony. There was yet another venue change, this time to Colorado City, and it's there on May 20th, 1896, that Bud Frazer was acquitted. Of course, by that time, Miller had already been forced to find himself another lawyer on account of Hardin getting himself gunned down the previous August. If you'd like to learn more about John Wesley, including his untimely demise and why he went to prison in the first place, please feel free to check out the 4-part series I did on him earlier this year, linked down below. Now, this probably goes without saying, but Deacon Jim wasn't happy about Frazer walking away without so much as a slap on the wrist. Guess he figured that if the courts weren't going to handle business, then he'd just take care of it his own self. That being the case, on the morning of September 14th, 1896, Miller snuck up on Frazer in a Reeves County saloon and gave him both barrels of buckshot. Per an eyewitness, quote, "All of a sudden, the room exploded like dynamite. I happened to be looking at Bud and like to have fainted when I saw his whole head disappear in a clot of splashing blood and bone." And once again, Miller found himself under arrest and charged with murder. Last thing he did before getting locked up was to publicly order all of Frazer's cronies to leave the county. Or else. He would even specifically call out the former sheriff's brother-in-law. Ugh, there's that word again. A guy by the name of Barney Riggs. Now, Barney was a deadly man in his own right. Much like Hardin, he had already done time behind bars for killing a man. And that certainly wasn't the first time that Riggs had used a gun in anger. Nor would it be his last. Matter of fact, as soon as Barney heard about Miller's threat, he shoved a .44 behind his belt and went on the hunt. By the time he arrived in Pecos, the good deacon was already in jail, so Riggs instead settled for a couple of Miller's henchmen, Bill Earhart and John Denson. And when the smoke cleared, both Earhart and Denson lay dead in the dirt. Barney surrendered to the sheriff, posted bond, and then told all who would listen, "I'm going home now. Miller claims that the territory is too small for the both of us." I agree. Tell him that I'm gonna have to kill him. End quote, and hell yeah, brother. Now, those two old boys who Riggs gunned down there in Pecos had both been shot in the head. And I don't know much, but I do know that a metal breastplate of the sort worn by Deacon Jim ain't gonna stop no bullet to the noggin. I guess Miller figured the same, and rather than test his luck with Barney Riggs, he instead just relocated some 300 plus miles away to the town of Eastland. Or at least that's according to historian Glenn Shirley. While Riggs did absolutely gun down Earhart and Denson, he did so some 6 months prior to Miller killing Frazer. So the assertion that Deacon Jim skipped town out of fear of Riggs is, in my opinion, simply false. I don't doubt that Deacon Jim was hesitant to go face-to-face with a man like Riggs, but it doesn't appear as if it was nerves that caused him to move. Truth is, he went to Eastland because that's where his murder trial was held. By this point, Jim and his wife already had a couple of kids, so he took a job managing a hotel as he awaited the trial. He also began attending church on the regular and just doing his level best to impress the locals, sort of like he had done back in Pecos. He even traveled all over the county with his minister, attending various prayer meetings and revivals. That being the case, once it was time for the trial to begin, several of Eastland's leading citizens testified that Miller, in addition to being a church deacon, was also a peaceable man whose conduct was as, quote, exemplary as that of a minister of the gospel, end quote. And believe it or not, this tactic did work. Of course it did. Trial ended with a hung jury, followed by a second trial in January of 1899 that saw Miller acquitted altogether. And once the trial was over, he almost immediately took up his old habits, went partners in a saloon there in Eastland, strong-armed his way into controlling the entire joint, and then sold it for a profit. This was followed by he and his family moving north to the town of Memphis, Texas, not Tennessee, where he purchased yet another drinking establishment. I know I mentioned it earlier that Jim avoided alcohol, but whether or not he was truly sober or just pretended to be for the church folks is up for debate. Case in point, after killing Bud Frazer, Miller allegedly bellied up to the bar in order to drink. Then again, if there's any occasion that calls for drinking alcohol, it's after taking a life, right? I'm also not aware of any instances of Miller getting wasted and shooting up a town, so who knows? Maybe he just indulged on occasion. Now, it was during this same period, when he moved up there to Memphis, that he somehow got himself appointed as a Special Texas Ranger under Captain William J. McDonald. In addition to his duties as a ranger, Miller would also work part-time as a deputy sheriff in nearby Collingsworth County. It's in such a capacity that he'd arrest John Beasley and Will Holmes for murder. A murder that just so happened to have been committed with a double-barreled shotgun. What are the odds? One of Miller's buddies, Joe Earp, no relation to Wyatt, even claimed to have witnessed Holmes and Beasley fleeing the scene. Turns out it was all bullshit, and Miller just wanted to collect on the reward. Rather than arrest the real culprit, which, let's be honest, was probably himself, he instead had Joe Earp make up a story about Holmes and Beasley. And once it was determined that Earp wasn't even in the county at the time that the killing took place, he found himself charged with perjury, at which point he turned state's evidence and rolled on Miller. And finally, at long last, Deacon Jim was found guilty and sentenced to prison. Of course, his lawyer then took the case to the Texas Court of Appeals, and the sentence was reversed. Not only did Miller remain a free man, but just a few weeks later, Joe Earp was shot dead from ambush. Jim would later admit to riding 100 miles on the night of Earp's murder just to establish an alibi. Earp's death was then followed by the mysterious demise of the district attorney who prosecuted Miller's case. Reports vary, but at least one sawbones would claim that the lawyer died of arsenic poisoning, Said he never mentioned it to authorities because he was scared of Jim's retaliation. Now, by the year 1900, the Millers ended up moving to the bustling metropolis of Fort Worth, Texas. He and his wife purchased a large home they converted to a rooming establishment as Jim began dabbling in real estate. And just like everywhere else, he became heavily involved in the church, just doing his level best to ingratiate himself among the respectable folks there at Fort Worth. He even took to hanging out at the Delaware Hotel, a popular meeting place for local businessmen. To quote historian Glenn Shirley, secretly he had evolved into a deadly, emotionless machine. The worm that had laid concealed in him for so long had gnawed to the surface. The word went out that his gun was for hire. He would kill anyone for a price. End quote. And yeah, despite it already being the 20th century, there were still parts of the West that remained wild and woolly. Literally woolly on account of all the damn sheep. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but cattle ranchers and sheep wranglers just did not get along back in the old days. Part of this was due to the misguided belief that cattle wouldn't graze on land previously inhabited by sheep. Also, many of the sheep herders were Hispanic, which I have to assume led to at least a little animosity. But for the most part, it was about land. Story as old as the Old West, right? Whether it be small-time ranchers up in Wyoming and Montana or sheep wranglers down in Texas, the results were the same. The cattle barons considered all land to be theirs and theirs alone. Even property they didn't have a title to. And you better believe they were willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. Of course, they didn't want to get their own hands dirty, so that's where our friend Deacon Jim came into play. I mean, think about it. If Miller wasn't afraid of blowing a sheriff's head off in front of God and everybody else, then he damn sure wasn't worried about dispatching a few errant shepherds. Especially considering that he was getting paid a going rate of $150 a head. Which, spoiler alert, is just a drop in the bucket to what he'd be earning just a few years later. Nonetheless, during the summer of 1902, Miller was rumored to have gunned down at least 4 sheep herders, as well as a pair of Mexicans that he claimed were butchering a steer that didn't belong to him. He also took to shooting or otherwise terrorizing farmers, or nesters as they were called by the big ranchers. Once again, this was all about asserting control over the land. And when a young lawyer by the name of James Jarrett took up the cause of the farmers and sheep herders, Miller killed him too. Allegedly. Story goes that it took 5 rounds from a Winchester to stop Jarrett from breathing, and Jim would later tell a friend that he was, quote, the hardest damn man to kill that I ever tackled. Now, full disclosure, according to Bill James in his biography on Miller, no source has yet been found to establish that such a killing took place. There are anecdotal stories, but you'd think that if a lawyer turned up shot to death, there would have at least been a couple of newspaper articles printed about it, right? And who knows, maybe there were, and Mr. James just never located them. By the way, speaking of James, my 2 main sources for researching today's topic were the books Jim Miller, The Untold Story of a Texas Bad Man by Bill C. James, and Shotgun for Hire by Glenn Shirley. They're both great reads with a ton of insight on Miller, but they're also somewhat outdated. I think Shotgun for Hire was published in 1970, and Jim Miller, The Untold Story, in the early 80s. So we're not exactly dealing with up-to-date information. I'm hoping that sometime in the near future, someone more talented than myself will take another stab at Miller's life. Got to assume there's even more information out there just awaiting to get discovered. Now, as to how many people Miller assassinated while he was persecuting those sheep wranglers, well, your guess is about as good as mine. He had obviously done well for himself, though, at least monetarily, as evidenced by his specially tailored suits and fancy diamond rings. But then again, he also didn't restrict his earning potential to just murders for hire. Miller also dabbled in real estate, stolen livestock, and he was even known on occasion to pass bogus checks. One of his more lucrative schemes was selling city lots located in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, that Gulf of Mexico. In other words, the damn ocean. Miller's partner, Frank Four, would sell these plots of land sight unseen to the buyers before he figured out Miller's game. Once he realized what was going on, he threatened to go before a grand jury, so Deacon Jim just did his thing. Followed Four into a washroom right there at Fort Worth's Delaware Hotel, pulled out a pistol, and shot him dead. As soon as a crowd began to form, Miller turned on the faucets and began crying, saying how awful it was to have had to kill a friend, but that Four had been reaching for his gun and left him no choice. Then, during the trial, a few of Miller's rich cattle baron cronies backed him up by testifying that Four had been going for a weapon and that Jim was simply defending himself. And once more, Deacon Jim Miller was acquitted. I'm really hoping today's not the day he decided to take a shot of liquor every time I say the words acquitted or acquittal. Later on, when asked by a friend how Ford died, Jim allegedly smiled and said, quote, "When he saw my gun, he squawked like a rooster," end quote. Shortly thereafter, an attempt was made on Miller's life, but the shooter's aim was off and the bullet passed harmlessly through Jim's hat. Whether or not this was a direct result of him killing Ford is unknown. Miller's next known murder occurred in late July of 1906 when he traveled to Oklahoma and gunned down Deputy U.S. Marshal Ben Collins. Just a couple years prior, Collins had shot and partially paralyzed a guy named Port Pruitt during the course of an arrest. Pruitt pressed charges, but the case was ultimately dropped, so his well-to-do brother Clint went and put a contract on the deputy's head. And not long after Collins' death, authorities arrested a guy named Ahmed Washmood and charged him with the murder. As it turns out, Washmood was just a bag man, and all he was guilty of doing was delivering a reported $1,800 to Miller. Eventually, the authorities figured out Jim's role, and he too was arrested once they located him at his sister's house in southwestern Oklahoma. He was held without bond in Ardmore, but by late 1907, he was admitted bail and skinned on out of the territory. I've been doing the Wild West Extravaganza for nearly 5 years now, and it still never ceases to amaze me how often these people just got by with cold-blooded murder. In the aforementioned book, Jim Miller, The Untold Story, author Bill James writes, quote, "Why Miller was successful in being released on bail each time he was charged with a murder became a point of speculation, but it was reliably reported that he had friends willing to exert influence on his behalf rather than allow him to relate embarrassing details of their own past association with him. From this, it would appear that the wealthy and prominent men had employed him to resolve difficulties that they encountered, and Miller was not reluctant to use that to his advantage." End quote. More on that in just a moment, but first, a word from today's sponsor. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is sponsored by BetterHelp. I am beyond grateful that you've chosen to listen to this little show of mine. It really means a lot to me, and I want you to know that. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I've actually been working a lot on being more grateful lately, trying to write down at least a few things each day that I'm thankful for. But if you're anything like me, sometimes the person that we oftentimes don't thank enough is ourselves. And why not? I mean, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to make sense of this crazy world, right? And let's face it, it's not always easy. So consider this your little reminder not only to thank those in your life who you hold dear, but also to thank yourself. And what better way to learn how to do so than therapy? Yeah, therapy. You know you've been thinking about it, so why not go ahead and give BetterHelp a try? It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So what's the hold up? Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/Wild West today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Wild West. And now back to the show. All right, welcome back. Like I said, Miller was acquitted yet again, and his next stop was New Mexico, where he would possibly take part in the assassination of one of the most famous lawmen in all of the United States. Guy you may have heard of named Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, a.k.a. the man who killed Billy the Kid. Now, this is somewhat of a complicated story, lots of different characters and moving parts, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but if you'd like to learn all the gritty details surrounding Pat's death, check out the 5-part series I did on him last August. You can find that link down below. Just to very quickly put things into context, way back in February of 1896, the prominent lawyer and politician Albert Jennings Fountain disappeared under extremely mysterious circumstances, both he and his young son. And by mysterious circumstances, I do mean they were murdered, it's just that their bodies were never located. Pat Garrett handled the investigation, and he soon pegged a rancher named Oliver Lee as one of the main culprits. And Lee just so happened to have some very powerful friends like the politician Albert Fall. You might be familiar with Fall from his participation in the Teapot Dome scandal. And hell, there are some who think that it was Fall who hired Lee to dispatch Fountain. All of this, by the way, was due to Fountain investigating and prosecuting cattle rustlers, one of whom was Oliver Lee. Like I said, there's a lot involved, but in time, Garrett would become enemies with both Lee and Albert Fall, along with several of their friends, including Pat's own neighbor, W.W. Cox, and Cox's right-hand man, Prent Rode. Also, during this same period, Garrett found himself on the brink of financial ruin, especially after losing his job as a customs collector over in El Paso. Needless to say, the former sheriff was not doing well by the early 1900s. There was even one point where most of his belongings were seized and auctioned off just to cover his unpaid debts. Skip ahead to early 1908, and Pat's son Dudley leased out his Bear Canyon ranch to a local cowpoke named Jesse Wayne Brazel. Initially, Brazel said he intended to run cattle, but instead he went and moved in a herd of nearly 2,000 goats, an action that enraged Garrett, as goats had pretty much the same stigma as sheep. To make matters worse, Pat soon learned that his avowed enemies, Print Road and W. Cox, were financially backing Brazel. I promise we'll get to Miller in just a second, just bear with me. This all makes sense. Now, at first, Garrett tried to void the lease, but when that panned out, he decided to let the courts handle it. There was a hearing, and even though it was the year of our Lord 1908, both parties came armed to the teeth. Print Road even tried to lure Garrett into a gunfight, but he wisely refused to take the bait. The case was predictably dismissed as Pat and Road and Brazel all swapped threats, with Pat being overheard saying that they would get to him if he didn't get to them first. And that's about the time when Deacon Jim Miller got involved. Finally! He and one of his in-laws, Carl Adamson, had recently made a trip from El Paso to Las Cruces in order to buy a ranch. Adamson's main business involved raising sheep, but he also dabbled in cattle, horses, and even goats. According to historian David G. Thomas, Miller and Adamson were unable to buy the ranch that they originally intended to purchase, but, quote, while in Las Cruces, they learned that Garrett was interested in selling his ranches. To explore that option, on February 6, Miller and Adamson visited Garrett at his home ranch. Adamson later testified that this visit to the home ranch was his first meeting with Garrett. Miller knew Garrett from numerous previous meetings. End of quote. Now, what those numerous previous meetings were about, I haven't got a clue. I do know this much, though. First, if Garrett had truly previously met Miller, then he should have known who he was dealing with. And secondly, both he, Miller, and Adamson were all in agreement when it came to selling off that land. Even Wayne Brazel was cool with having his lease terminated on the condition that someone would also purchase his goats. Okay, fine. Carl Adamson said that he'd buy all 1,200 of them for $3.50 a head. Only problem is, when Brazel went and recounted the herd, he discovered that he had a total of 1,800 goats as opposed to just 1,200. Well, that was 600 more goats than Adamson was interested in buying, and Brazel wasn't going to get off the lease unless someone bought all of them. So the deal was off. Got to imagine Garrett's blood was boiling by this point. Here he was within a cunt's hair, finally having a decent payday, and that smooth-brained Brazel was once again causing problems. Finally, Adamson said that he would meet with both Pat and Brazel over in Las Cruces and see if they couldn't come to a mutually beneficial agreement. As such, he and Garrett left Garrett's home ranch the next morning, February 29, 1908. And unfortunately, Pat would never make it to Las Cruces alive. Now, according to Adamson, they soon met Brazel on the road, and Brazel just decided to ride the rest of the way into town right alongside him. Didn't take long for the conversation to gravitate towards those damn goats, and things quickly grew heated. Pat began to somewhat verbally abuse Wayne for getting the count wrong in the first place. I mean, how in the hell do you undercount that many goats? Brazel just kept on saying that he wasn't going to sell out unless he had a buyer for all of them. Pat said that he didn't care whether or not Brazel gave up possession of the ranch or not, and that he would get him off the land one way or the other. To which Brazel replied, I don't know whether you can or not. Now this causes Adamson to all of a sudden need to relieve himself. He halts the buggy and hands the reins over to Pat before stepping away to water the dirt. Next thing he knows, Garrett yells out, God damn you, I will put you off now, followed immediately by the sound of a gunshot. Carl spins around, no word on whether or not he was still in midstream, just in time to see Pat fall backwards, followed by Brazel aiming and firing his pistol. Garrett then stretched, made a grunting noise, and gave up the ghost. Now, Brazel did turn himself in, and he did confess to killing Pat Garrett. But at the same time, he steadfastly maintained that it was in self-defense. According to him, Garrett was going for his shotgun, so he, Brazel, was simply defending himself. Story doesn't really add up, though, especially considering that the doctor who inspected Garrett's wounds said he was shot from behind. And then, of course, there's all the extenuating circumstances, like Adamson being related to Jim Miller and Brazel's financial backing by Garrett's enemies, Print Road and W. Cox. And oddly enough, even Cox had connections to Jim Miller, going way back. As it turns out, he fought on the side of the Clements and Taylor factions during the Sutton-Taylor feud. Look, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not all that big on coincidences. Just the mere fact that Miller was in the area and that he did meet with Garrett, and also that he was connected to both Cox and Adamson, is, in my opinion, enough cause to raise at least a little suspicion. And even way back in 1908, there were those who thought that it was Miller who pulled the trigger and that Brazel was just the fall guy. Matter of fact, in 1970, an author named Killin Rickards put forth his own little theory in a book titled How Pat Garrett Died. According to Rickards, there was a big meeting held over in El Paso with most of Garrett's enemies in attendance. Guys like Cox, Print Road, Carl Adamson, Oliver Lee, Albert Fall, and yes, even our very own Deacon Jim Miller. According to Rickards, the purpose of this meeting was to figure out a way to gain control of Garrett's ranch. And I guess they decided that the only way they could do that was by killing Garrett. Miller agreed to be the shooter on the condition that Cox would find somebody else to take the blame, hence the involvement of Jesse Wayne Brazel. Thus began the intricate plot of leasing Garrett's land, introducing thousands of sheep, and then luring him out to an isolated location so Miller could finish him off. And according to Mr. Rickards, that's exactly what happened on February 29, 1909. Only instead of Brazel shooting Garrett, it was Miller. Once again, according to Mr. Rickards, Jim was just hiding off in the distance, so he was able to pick Garrett off with a rifle. I've even read others who speculate that Brazel then added a shot of his own from his pistol, just in order to make it all that more believable. Now, all that said, there are some pretty serious flaws to this theory. The first being that there's absolutely zero evidence of any secretive meetings being held in El Paso. Also, the idea of Garrett being killed over his land is laughable at best. Hell, W. Cox had actually sold the ranch to Pat back in 1897. Furthermore, the land had recently been appraised as being worth just $475. So why exactly would Cox spend thousands of bucks paying off both Brazel and Jim Miller, go through all the trouble of having those goats hauled in, and kill his own neighbor in cold blood just in order to obtain land valued at less than $500? Also, there's the fact that Garrett had not yet finished paying off the property. W. Cox still held the mortgage, so if he wanted the ranch all that bad, he could have just foreclosed on it without becoming an accessory to murder. As for Jim Miller being the trigger man, well, he was definitely in Las Cruces on the same exact day that Garrett was killed. Once again, I'll be the first to admit that his presence alone is enough to raise eyebrows. You know what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire. But then again, and I do know that people hate it when I say this, but you've got to have at least a semblance of evidence. And despite the anecdotal stories and Miller being in that same area, there's just no hard proof of him being Garrett's assassin. Even the logistics are complicated. And I really like what David G. Thomas says in his book, Killin Pat Garrett. According to Mr. Thomas, quote, "Let us debunk this absurd theory once and for all. The facts are that Miller rode into Las Cruces by train on February 29th, the day the deal papers were to be signed. He took a room at the Park Hotel. If Miller killed Garrett, he would have had to have snuck out of the Park Hotel that morning, rent a horse at the livery stable, sneak to where Garrett was shot, sneak back to the livery stable, turn in his horse, and sneak back into the Park Hotel, all without anyone seeing him." End quote. And yeah, I agree. I mean, if you think about it, there's really no sensible reason for all those dramatics. You know, the secretive meetings and all the various players and goats and all that. If all they wanted was for Miller to assassinate Garrett, then why go through all that trouble? All Deacon Jim really had to do was just hide behind a hill and gun Pat down at his earliest convenience. No need to involve all those people, much less damn near 2,000 goats. Anyway, like I said earlier, check out that series I did on Garrett if you'd like to learn more. Also, there's the book Killin Pat Garrett by David G. Thomas and Pat Garrett, Story of a Lawman by Leon Metz. They both do a really great job at dissecting all the available information. And for those of you who still think that Miller was the one who killed Garrett, well, you're in good company. Lorenzo Walters, who apparently knew all involved, also thought that Miller was the hitter. So did Texas Ranger John R. Hughes and the famed lawman D. Harkey, both of whom had their own run-ins with Deacon Jim. That said, it does seem as if most modern-day historians think that it was Wayne Brazel who was Garrett's true killer. Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is usually the most correct explanation. And it doesn't get much more simple than Brazel being scared shitless of Garrett and determined to kill him before he himself got. Now, Jim Miller would leave Las Cruces just a few days later on March 4th, 1908. He'd later be subpoenaed by Brazil's defense attorney, but, well, let's just say that by that point, Miller was somewhat preoccupied. We'll get to that in just a bit. In the meantime, he simply headed back home to Fort Worth. Miller still had that impending trial up in Ardmore hanging over his head, so he just bid his time and occupied himself with gambling and his various real estate ventures. Then, on December 29th, 1909, his brother-in-law, Manny Clements, was gunned down in El Paso's Coney Island Saloon. Lots of history in the Coney Island Saloon, by the way, which I definitely do not have time to get into right now. Miller initially vowed revenge, but before he got a chance, he got called in for another piece of work up in Oklahoma. And for the price of $2,000, I guess Deacon Jim found it hard to say no. By the way, $2,000 back then is equivalent to around $60,000 in today's money. So we're not exactly dealing with chump change here. As for the victim, well, apparently a guy up in Oklahoma named Gus Bobbitt was feuding with his rivals Jesse West and Joe Allen. Or at least he was before West and Allen were booted out of town. They relocated to the Texas Panhandle and did well enough for themselves financially, but I don't reckon they ever got over that sting of being ran out of Oklahoma. So they went ahead and hired our very own Deacon Jim Miller to set things straight. And sure enough, on February 27th, 1909, Gus Bobbitt was thoroughly ventilated by 2 blasts from a double-barreled shotgun. He and one of his buddies, Bob Ferguson, had left the town of Ada earlier that day and were nearly to Bobbitt's ranch when they came across a man on horseback. A mysterious figure spoke with Bobbitt for a moment before galloping away. And a little further down the trail is when the assassination occurred. According to Ferguson, the first load of buckshot struck Bobbitt in his legs and caused him to rear up in the buggy. The second shot caught him in the left side as he yelled out, "Oh God," and fell to the ground. His team ran off, and so did Ferguson, jumping from his own buggy and taking refuge in the bushes. It was then that he saw the same man that they had met previously on the road, saw him emerge from the tree line and take off down the trail. As I'm sure you can imagine, the next morning, the population of Ada was absolutely buzzing. Locals raised several $100s to fund a manhunt, and nearly every single resident that could carry a rifle set out in pursuit. Sure enough, it didn't take them long to figure out where the mystery man, aka Jim Miller, had cut a fence in order to cross through a pasture. They found 2 more fences cut in a similar fashion and followed the tracks all the way to a farm just south of Francis. It's there where they located a horse matching the exact description of the one that Ferguson said that mystery man was riding. As it turns out, the owner of the horse was Jim Miller's nephew, John Williamson. He played it cool at first, but eventually admitted that whoever had borrowed the horse would kill him if he said anything, to which the posse replied, "Well, what in the hell do you think we're going to do if you don't start talking?" So he confessed. Said that Miller was his uncle and that he had showed up at the farm one day in a wagon driven by a guy named Oscar Peeler. Miller claimed to be in the area looking to trade some land for cattle and that he needed the temporary use of a horse. And when Uncle Jim returned the horse, the saddle blanket was plumb sweated through. Not only that, but Miller was very open about having just killed Gus Bobbitt. Told his nephew to keep his mouth shut lest he likewise wind up dead. Now, authorities were able to determine where Miller stayed in Ardmore. The lady who owned the boarding house specifically mentioned him having a big shotgun covered in an oilcloth with tan straps around it. This also perfectly matches the description given by that eyewitness Ferguson. Unfortunately, by the time the local law had put 2 and 2 together, Miller had already fled the state. So instead, they arrested the aforementioned Oscar Peeler. The then just 19-year-old claimed that Miller had hired him to be a driver. It wasn't until they stuck him behind bars and charged him as an accomplice in murder that he started talking the truth. Said that he was the go-between for Miller and Joe Allen and Jesse West, guys I mentioned earlier who had been feuding with Bobbitt. It was Peeler's job to drive Miller around, and once the hit was over, to ensure that he received payment. And just so happens that Peeler named another suspect, a livestock dealer by the name of Barry Burrell. Apparently, it was Burrell who pointed Bobbitt out for Miller right there on the streets of Ada on the morning of the murder. Now, even though Burrell and Miller had returned to Texas, they were soon rounded up and extradited back to Oklahoma. When he got arrested, Jim told the lawmen, quote, "I've never given any officers trouble who came after me. I prefer to take my chances in court," end quote. He also asked permission to carry a brace of revolvers with him, but this request was denied. And by April 1st, he was back in Ada, behind bars. All that was left now was to apprehend Allen and West. This proved easy enough, as the prosecuting attorney simply sent him a wire, pretending to be Miller, and questioned their presence in Ada at once. As soon as they arrived, they were promptly thrown into the same jail cell as Deacon Jim and Barry Burrell. As for Miller's nephew and the buggy driver, Oscar Peeler, well, they turned state's evidence. And for their own protection, they were kept at the county jail over in Tecumseh. Now, I gotta admit, like him or not, Jim Miller certainly knew how to do time. Whereas West and Allen and Burrell were all scared shitless, Miller just laughed at the predicament and did his best to make the most out of it. He shaved his face twice a day, had fresh linen sent for his bed each morning, dressed impeccably, tipped the jailers, and even dined on porterhouse steaks from a nearby restaurant. What's more, it didn't take long before letters and telegrams began rolling in extolling Jim's virtues. Prominent ranchers from all over Texas and New Mexico began pressuring the authorities to drop the charges. Hal Miller even secured the services of noted attorney Moman Pruitt to defend him in court. Now, just to give you an idea, Moman Pruitt was known as the quote-unquote murderer's messiah, on account of him defending 342 murder cases. And out of those 342, they were all acquitted, save for 38, who just ended up getting convicted of a lesser charge. Only one of his defendants was actually found guilty for murder, but even then, Pruitt was able to have the death sentence overturned via presidential pardon. So yeah, not only is Deacon Jim making no bones about having money, he's pretty much just flaunting his wealth from behind bars, but he's also got an attorney who's all but guaranteed to get him set free. And you better believe this was not lost on the good citizens of Ada, Oklahoma. Trust me when I say that they was about fed up with how violent the area had become. That very same year, there had already been 36 murders committed within the city of Ada or its immediate vicinity. And just weeks before Miller's arrest, another old boy named Stevenson was acquitted and set free after murdering the town marshal. And I guess folks there in Ada figured enough's enough. Rather than risk Miller getting yet another acquittal, they decided to take matters into their own hands, which they did at approximately 2 a.m. on April 19th, 1909. A mob of around 20 or so masked men stormed the jail, pistol-whipped the guards, and tied them up with baling wire. The prisoners were next. Only West attempted to resist and was beaten to a bloody pulp. The others, Miller included, wisely decided to keep their mouths shut and do what they was told. They were then led down an alley to a barn just behind the jail and had their hands tied behind them. Apparently, the nooses were already hanging from the rafters when they arrived. The first to swing was Jesse West. Allen and Burrell followed, and finally, it was Miller's turn. His executioners tried to coax him into a confession, but rather than admit to any one murder or victim by name, all he said was, quote, "Just let the record show that I've killed 51 men. Miller then removed his diamond ring and asked that it be sent to his wife. He did likewise with a diamond shirt stud and asked that it be given to one of the jailers who had been kind to him. Finally, Miller requested his trademark frock coat, but the mob declined. So instead, he asked for his hat, which they finally agreed to give him. After one of the vigilantes shoved it down over his head, Miller laughed and said, "I'm ready now. You couldn't have killed me otherwise. Let her rip." Seconds later, Miller was hoisted up by his neck, and just like his compadres, he spent the next several minutes slowly strangling to death. It wasn't until he stopped kicking that they finally acquiesced and placed his coat around his shoulders. To quote Glenn Shirley in Shotgun for Hire, "The ghastly business done, the mob dispersed in the night through a light drizzle of rain that had begun to fall. The identities of the members of the lynch mob were never established. No one really cared. Too long had the town's growth been thwarted under the trigger fingers of the most cold-blooded killers in the Southwest. They had brought the curtain down with gruesome solemnity on an outlaw era." End quote. Miller's body was shipped back to Fort Worth on April 20th, where he was buried at the Oakwood Cemetery with a large stone placed over his grave. A stone that, according to biographer Bill James, is perhaps as cold as the deeds as the man whose grave it marks. Now, earlier I stated that Miller confessed to killing 51 men. Obviously, we haven't covered 51 killings on today's episode, but it does look as if Deacon Jim wasn't always the trigger man. There were some murders, like the case of a guy named William Janes, where he allegedly acted as more of an advisor. Most of these charges were later dismissed, but I'm willing to bet there were plenty of other killings that he was involved in that we just aren't aware of. Now, before we wrap things up, I just wanted to mention that during the course of this episode, I did refer to Miller as Deacon Jim Miller, mostly on account of me liking the way it sounds. But that said, he's also known as Killin Jim Miller and Killer Jim, but it doesn't appear as if anyone referred to him by any of these names, including Deacon Jim, until after his death. The only nickname that was consistently recorded as being associated with him during his own lifetime was that of Kid Miller. And I guess that's about all I've got on Deacon Jim Miller. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're hankering for some more true tales from the wild woolly west, just head on over to wildwestextra.com. All right, till next time, be nice and adios.